Hello, my friends. I want to begin with President Trump's recent remarks, because they reveal more clearly than any official policy paper the mindset now driving U.S. foreign policy. When asked directly whether the United States intends to take action against Greenland, Trump deflected. He said he did not want to talk about Greenland at the moment. Instead, he wanted to talk about Venezuela, Russia, and Ukraine. Then he contradicted himself by saying Greenland would be addressed in about 2 months, only to follow that by saying 20 days. That contradiction is not accidental. It signals that Greenland is not a theoretical issue. It is a scheduled objective. Trump then made the core argument explicit. He said the United States needs Greenland for national security reasons. He claimed Greenland is currently surrounded by Russian and Chinese ships and that Denmark is incapable of defending it. He mocked Denmark by saying their latest security upgrade amounted to adding one more dog sled team. According to Trump, that was supposed to be a serious move. What Trump did here was strip away the usual diplomatic language and say plainly what Washington normally tries to conceal. Greenland is no longer viewed as the sovereign territory of an ally, but as a strategic asset not yet fully controlled. He went further and stated that the European Union needs the United States to have Greenland, and that Europe knows this. That statement, crude as it was, contained a great deal of truth. European leaders understand that Washington is moving toward control of Greenland, and they also understand that they have no real ability to stop it. From there, the discussion moves naturally to Venezuela, because Venezuela demonstrates how this imperial logic is being operationalized in real time. According to reporting by the New York Times, Nicolas Maduro was transported to New York in an open van, driven around the city in full public view, paraded through the streets of the city that hosts the United Nations. This was not law enforcement. This was political theater. It was humiliation by design. I said days earlier that the Trump administration would parade Maduro once they captured him, and that is exactly what happened. The New York Times also strongly hints that what occurred in Venezuela was not simply a military operation, but a classic palace coup. According to their reporting, the Trump administration had already identified Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as an acceptable replacement for Maduro, at least on an interim basis. She was viewed as someone who could manage Venezuela's oil industry in a way favorable to U.S. energy interests. The article states that intermediaries, not Rodriguez directly, but people around her, assured Washington that she would protect future American energy investments. If this reporting is accurate, then what happened in Venezuela was not a heroic liberation or a clean counterterrorism operation. It was an old-fashioned coup d'etat carried out through back-channel deals and internal betrayal. One detail makes this especially clear. U.S. helicopters flew freely over Caracas. There was no meaningful air defense response. That does not happen unless powerful figures inside the Venezuelan system allowed it to happen. Someone at a very high level turned against Maduro. Publicly, Rodriguez has repeatedly expressed loyalty to Maduro and opposition to U.S. interference. But public rhetoric and private negotiations are often two very different things, especially under the threat of overwhelming military force. After Maduro's abduction, the new acting authorities in Venezuela quickly extended an invitation to the United States for cooperation on a new agenda. One can reasonably argue that they recognized they would be unable to prevent a second, even more devastating U.S. strike. Trump publicly warned that resistance would be met with far greater force. The death toll now exceeds 100. These are not U.S. casualties. These include Cuban personnel, Venezuelan security forces, and civilians. Among the dead is an 81-year-old woman killed inside her apartment. This is what peace on earth looks like in practice. Aboard Air Force One, Trump, Lindsey Graham, and Lutnick appeared relaxed and cheerful. When asked who was in charge of Venezuela, Trump replied bluntly, "We're in charge." When questioned about political prisoners, he said that was not the priority. Fixing oil production was. Trump did not attempt to hide the reality. This was about oil. Lindsey Graham went even further. He gloated that Maduro could have gone to Turkey but instead ended up in New York. He declared that Maduro deserved what happened and warned that Cuba would be next. Marco Rubio, who now wields enormous influence, has made no secret of his desire to see the Cuban government fall. Trump also suggested that a U.S. operation against Colombia would sound good. Regarding Iran, he issued open threats, portraying himself as the global protector of protesters and Christians. Then there is the matter of the drone activity near President Putin's residence. Trump admitted that drones were operating nearby, though he claimed they were not targeting the residence itself. Even if one accepts that explanation, sending drones into the vicinity of a nuclear-armed head of state's home is reckless in the extreme. It is the geopolitical equivalent of flying drones near the White House and pretending it is harmless because they were not aimed directly at the building. Returning to Greenland, Trump revealed the strategic logic plainly. Control of Greenland means dominance in the Arctic, pressure on Russia, restriction of Chinese trade routes, and a forward military position closer to Europe. It also means positioning Europe for confrontation with Russia around the end of this decade. European leaders know this. They will protest publicly, issue statements about sovereignty, and express outrage, but in the end, they will comply. They lack leverage. The Danish Prime Minister's statement rejecting any U.S. takeover of Greenland was legally correct but politically hollow. If Trump threatens to withdraw from NATO, Denmark will fold. The same European governments that justify coups elsewhere suddenly discover the importance of sovereignty when it affects them. The European Union's response to the Venezuelan coup was particularly revealing. They argued that Maduro lacked legitimacy and therefore what happened was acceptable. This is not new. It is the same script used in Ukraine in 2014 and elsewhere. Once the collective West declares a leader illegitimate, anything becomes permissible: coup, kidnapping, regime change. What follows is always the same language, calls for a smooth transition, appeals to international law after it has already been violated, and demands that everyone move on. There are also indications that major financial interests stand to gain enormously from Venezuela's collapse and restructuring. Large holders of Venezuelan debt, who purchased it at steep discounts, may now collect tens of billions with U.S. backing. This does not prove motive, but it certainly aligns incentives. Finally, we see the propaganda layer. Fake videos purporting to show Venezuelans celebrating Maduro's removal are spreading across social media. These are being amplified by major accounts aligned with U.S. narratives. Independent journalists have demonstrated that these videos are false, but accuracy no longer matters. The goal is emotional conditioning, not truth. Taken together, this paints a deeply troubling picture. Kidnapping heads of state, threatening allies, preparing territorial seizures, provoking nuclear powers, all of it justified under the banner of democracy and peace. This is not peace. It is organized recklessness. To understand where this is heading, we need to step back and look at the broader strategic pattern. Because Venezuela is not an isolated case. It is a template. What happened there follows a familiar sequence. First, a narrative is constructed. The leader is illegitimate, criminal, dangerous, and a threat beyond his borders. Second, sanctions are imposed, hollowing out the economy and creating internal stress. Third, quiet contacts are made with insiders, people who are ambitious, fearful, or simply pragmatic. Fourth, military pressure is applied just enough to make resistance seem futile. Finally, the removal is presented as inevitable, justified, and even welcomed. Venezuela fits this pattern perfectly. The absence of meaningful resistance during the operation is not a sign of weakness alone. It is evidence of coordination. States do not simply collapse at the moment of attack unless key nodes have already been neutralized politically. That is why the New York Times reporting matters. It is not accidental. It is signaling that Washington wants the world to understand that this was not chaos, it was managed. The United States now claims it is helping Venezuela rebuild, but the order of priorities tells the real story. Elections are postponed. Political prisoners are an afterthought. Oil infrastructure comes first. Debt settlements come first. Foreign investment protections come first. Sovereignty comes last. And this is precisely why the Greenland issue matters so much. Greenland represents the same mindset applied to territory rather than leadership. Trump's remarks were not a gaffe. They were a declaration. The United States no longer feels compelled to hide its intentions behind legal frameworks or alliance language. The logic is blunt. If we need it, we take it. Denmark is a NATO member. Greenland is covered by Article 5. None of that matters if the United States decides it does not matter. NATO, in practical terms, exists at the pleasure of Washington. The moment Washington threatens withdrawal, the alliance ceases to function as a collective and becomes what it has always been beneath the surface, a hierarchy. European leaders understand this, which is why their resistance is rhetorical rather than real. They issue statements not to stop Washington, but to preserve domestic legitimacy. They need to appear sovereign even as they concede power. This is also why the European Union's stance on legitimacy is so dangerous. Once legitimacy becomes a political judgment rather than a legal one, there are no limits. Any leader who defies Western economic or strategic interests can be declared illegitimate retroactively. At that point, international law becomes a decorative concept rather than a constraint. Russia and China are watching this closely, and they are drawing conclusions. When Trump dismisses concerns about drone activity near Putin's residence, he is not calming tensions, he is normalizing escalation. If proximity without intent is acceptable, then every red line becomes flexible. That is how miscalculations occur. That is how wars start. The same applies to Iran. Threats issued casually, framed as moral obligations, create conditions where restraint is interpreted as weakness and escalation as resolve. This is a dangerous feedback loop, especially when combined with domestic political incentives that reward aggression. The United States political system currently incentivizes spectacle over stability. Public humiliation of foreign leaders plays well on television. Military bravado translates into polling numbers. Nuance does not survive this environment. The presence of powerful financial interests further distorts decision-making. When distressed assets suddenly become profitable through regime change, it is impossible to separate strategy from speculation. The line between national interest and private enrichment becomes blurred beyond recognition. This is not conspiracy. It is structure. The celebration by certain corporate and political elites following Maduro's removal is telling. Optimism about business opportunities emerges immediately, even as civilian casualties are still being counted. Reconstruction is framed not as recovery for Venezuelans, but as opportunity for investors. Meanwhile, the information space is flooded with falsified images and videos designed to manufacture consent. The purpose is not to inform, but to exhaust skepticism. When people see enough repetition, disbelief fades, not because the story is true, but because resistance becomes tiring. This is how modern power operates. Not through persuasion, but through saturation. What makes this moment especially dangerous is the erosion of restraint at the top. When leaders speak openly about taking territory, threatening allies, and expanding military operations without consequence, they invite imitation. Others will adopt the same logic. Once that happens, the system becomes unstable. Greenland today, Venezuela yesterday, another country tomorrow. This is not a rules-based order. It is power politics stripped of pretense. And history tells us where that leads. At this stage, it becomes necessary to address the strategic endgame, because what we are witnessing is not improvisation. It is convergence. The Arctic is no longer a peripheral theater. It is emerging as a central axis of future conflict, and Greenland sits at the heart of it. Control of Greenland means control of surveillance, logistics, missile defense, and access routes across the polar region. It also means the ability to project power deep into the North Atlantic and toward the European continent. When Trump speaks about Russian and Chinese ships near Greenland, he is not describing a threat so much as justifying a claim. The implication is simple: presence equals entitlement. If Russia and China are active there, then the United States must dominate the space. This is not defensive logic. It is competitive escalation. From Washington's perspective, Greenland provides something even more valuable than minerals or geography. It provides leverage over Europe. Europe is being prepared psychologically, economically, and militarily for a prolonged confrontation with Russia. The timeline that is increasingly referenced inside strategic planning circles points toward the end of this decade. The buildup of arms production, the normalization of war rhetoric, and the steady erosion of diplomatic off-ramps are all consistent with this trajectory. Greenland, in this context, becomes a forward operating platform. It shortens supply lines. It tightens command and control. It embeds the United States even more deeply into Europe's security architecture, making any European deviation from Washington's line increasingly difficult. This is why European leaders are trapped. Publicly, they must object to any talk of annexation. Privately, they understand that resistance is futile. The illusion of partnership must be maintained, even as autonomy evaporates. The Venezuela operation fits neatly into this broader picture. It demonstrates that Washington is willing to discard legal norms when they become inconvenient. That lesson is not lost on Moscow or Beijing. Both are recalibrating their assumptions about what restraint buys them. When regime change is normalized, deterrence logic shifts. If leaders believe they are personally at risk of arrest, humiliation, or assassination, then incentives favor preemption over patience. Stability relies on predictability, and predictability is being dismantled piece by piece. The casual discussion of strikes, whether in Colombia, Iran, or elsewhere, reinforces this perception. These are not contingency plans spoken reluctantly. They are floated as options, as talking points, as expressions of confidence. That tone matters. It signals that force is no longer a last resort but a default instrument. The drone episode near Putin's residence is particularly illustrative. Even if one accepts the claim that the residence itself was not targeted, the act still constitutes a signal. Proximity is permissible. Once that logic is accepted, the margin for error disappears. Accidents become casus belli. In such an environment, crisis management becomes nearly impossible. Meanwhile, domestic political dynamics in the United States amplify the problem. There is little cost to being wrong, but significant reward for appearing strong. Escalation plays better than caution. Punishment comes not from failure, but from hesitation. This creates a leadership culture that values audacity over judgment. The financial dimension further accelerates this momentum. When war, sanctions, and regime change become investment opportunities, policy becomes distorted. Decisions that should be weighed in terms of human cost are reframed as balance sheet outcomes. Reconstruction contracts, debt recovery, and asset access become implicit motivators. This does not require conspiracy. It emerges naturally from the alignment of power and profit. The propaganda ecosystem completes the cycle. False images, emotional narratives, and selective outrage are not side effects. They are essential tools. They soften resistance at home while demonizing targets abroad. They reduce complex societies to caricatures that can be managed rather than understood. Over time, this corrodes public perception. War becomes abstract. Victims become statistics. Consequences fade from view. What remains is momentum. The danger now is not any single decision, but the accumulation of them. Each step lowers the threshold for the next. Each precedent makes the next violation easier to justify. By the time a true red line is crossed, no one remembers where it was supposed to be. Greenland is not about Greenland. Venezuela is not about Venezuela. These are signals. They tell us that the post-Cold War restraint, fragile as it was, is being abandoned. Power is once again speaking openly, without apology, without disguise. History is unforgiving in such moments. What we are witnessing now is not merely a shift in policy, it is a collapse of restraint. For decades, the United States maintained at least the appearance of limits, legal limits, diplomatic limits, rhetorical limits. Those limits were often violated, but they were rarely discarded openly. What has changed is not that power is being used, but that it is being used without shame, without pretense, and without concern for the precedents being set. The abduction of a sitting head of state, the casual discussion of territorial acquisition, and the open threat of military action against multiple countries are not isolated incidents. They are expressions of a worldview that sees dominance as stability and coercion as leadership. This worldview is profoundly dangerous. Once the idea takes hold that legitimacy is something bestowed by power rather than derived from law, the international system becomes a contest of narratives backed by force. The strongest voice defines reality. Everyone else adapts or suffers the consequences. The European Union's response to Venezuela illustrates this perfectly. By accepting the premise that Maduro lacked legitimacy, the EU implicitly endorsed the method used to remove him. In doing so, it surrendered any moral authority to object when similar logic is applied closer to home. Denmark's protest over Greenland rings hollow for the same reason. Sovereignty cannot be selectively defended. Either it matters universally, or it does not matter at all. The tragedy is that Europe understands this, but feels powerless to resist. Decades of dependency have produced a political class that mistakes alignment for security and obedience for partnership. The result is a continent that speaks the language of autonomy while living the reality of subordination. For Russia and China, the lesson is unmistakable. Negotiation offers no protection, compliance offers no safety, the only currency that matters is power. Under such conditions, restraint becomes irrational. This is how arms races accelerate, this is how escalation spirals, this is how accidents turn into catastrophes. The Arctic will not remain quiet, the Caribbean will not stabilize, the Middle East will not calm down. These regions are being wired into a single, global confrontation structure in which crises are no longer resolved, only managed until the next one erupts. The most alarming aspect of this trajectory is the absence of serious internal debate in Washington. Dissent is dismissed as weakness, caution is labeled disloyalty, complex realities are flattened into slogans. When leadership becomes performative, policy becomes theatrical. And theatrical power is the most volatile kind. The financialization of conflict compounds the risk. When war creates winners in boardrooms, peace becomes inconvenient. When suffering translates into opportunity, moral breaks fail. At the same time, the information environment ensures that the public remains distracted, emotionally polarized, and poorly informed. Manufactured images replace reality. Outrage is curated. Attention is weaponized. This is not a system designed for long-term survival. It is a system optimized for short-term dominance. History offers no comfort here. Empires that abandon restraint do not collapse immediately. They overextend. They provoke. They exhaust themselves in conflicts they no longer know how to avoid. The path being chosen now leads not to peace, but to confrontation layered upon confrontation, until one of them cannot be managed. Greenland, Venezuela, Ukraine, the Arctic, the Middle East, these are not separate stories. They are chapters of the same one. And the ending, if this course is not altered, will not be written by strategists or politicians. It will be written by events. That is the danger of power that no longer listens. The central danger of this moment is not miscalculation alone. It is certainty when power convinces itself that it is always right, that its motives are inherently moral, and that resistance is proof of illegitimacy. It stops listening. And when power stops listening, it stops learning. At that point, history no longer bends, it snaps. What is unfolding before us is a strategic environment in which force is normalized, sovereignty is conditional, and legality is retroactive. Leaders are judged not by law, but by alignment. Countries are valued not for stability, but for utility. Peace is no longer defined as the absence of war, but as the temporary silence between operations. This is not strength. It is strategic arrogance. The removal of restraint does not create order, it creates volatility. Each action taken without consequence encourages the next one to go further. Each boundary crossed becomes evidence that boundaries never mattered. Eventually, escalation is no longer a choice, it is momentum. Empires rarely fall because they are weak. They fall because they mistake dominance for permanence and intimidation for control. They expand faster than they can stabilize, provoke faster than they can manage, and threaten faster than they can deter. We are now entering that phase. Greenland is not an exception. Venezuela is not an anomaly. These are signals that the rules are being rewritten in real time by those who believe they will never be bound by them. But power has a blind spot. It assumes others will always absorb pressure rather than respond to it. History shows the opposite. Pressure accumulates, resentment hardens, alternatives form, and when the response comes, it rarely comes on terms favorable to the one who assumed dominance. The tragedy is that this trajectory is not inevitable. It is chosen by leaders who believe escalation is manageable, that crises can always be controlled, and that others will always blink first. They are wrong. The world does not break all at once. It fractures gradually through precedents, through justifications, through normalized excess. By the time the rupture is obvious, the mechanisms to prevent it are already gone. That is where we are now. And unless restraint returns, not rhetorically, but structurally, the future will not be shaped by diplomacy or law, but by collision. Power that refuses limits eventually finds them. And when it does, the cost is never paid by those who spoke most confidently, but by everyone else